Everyone except the Poles has forgotten about the Russo-Polish Wars that were the tail end of the Russian Civil War. The basic summary is that the young Polish nation got involved in the Russian Civil War after the end of World War I, invading Russia. The Communists won the Civil War and drove the Poles back into Poland, driving on their capital of Poland, Warsaw. The Poles were finally able to beat the Russians at the Battle of Warsaw, securing their independence, led by the brilliant General Pilsudski. So what if the Russians won a battle you've probably never heard of? How would the rest of history be different? The answers will probably surprise you. There are so many ways the Soviets could have won this battle. For much of the battle, the Soviets heavily outnumbered the Poles, and so if anything went differently, the Russians would have probably won. Had the Poles not jammed the Russian communications, or Pilsudski decided the strategy of using most of his troops in a flanking attack, thus leaving the center fairly undefended, the strategy which won the battle in our timeline as too daring, had the Russian cavalry reinforcements actually arrived, instead of just pillaging the Polish countryside, etc., would have turned the battle in the Russians' favor. Had the Russians won the battle, they would have conquered Poland. The Polish nation was only 2 years old by the time the battle took place, so if the Russians conquered the capital, there wouldn't be the strength left for resistance. Poland would be made part of the Soviet Union, as it was originally part of the Russian Empire, and this is what happened to the other parts of the Russian Empire that the Soviets reconquered during the Civil War. Lenin, the leader of Russia, believed that the global communist revolution was imminent and inevitable. He especially felt the revolution would take place within a few months in Germany. He felt that the Germans and Russians would combine to make some super-communist nation that would dominate the world. The Spartacist revolt, in which German communists revolted, had taken place only a year earlier, and so communist revolt was still part of the general zeitgeist in Germany. This would make Lenin try to invade Germany as soon as possible after the invasion of Poland, and try to trigger a communist revolution in that nation. The logic would be that the German communists, seeing their communist brethren invading, would side with them, thus leading to the conquest of Germany. This would likely come in the form of an invasion of Germany in the spring following the conquest of Poland. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. For a couple of reasons, this invasion would probably end up being one of the worst failures in history, one of them being supply. In our timeline, by the time the Russians were invading Warsaw, their supply lines were stretched to the absolute limit, with many troops fighting barefoot and ammunition stocks very low. If the Polish army wasn't a completely pitiful affair as well, the Russians would have had no chance of winning the battle. Even with 6 months to rebuild their supply lines, the Russians would still be unbelievably overstretched in an attack on Germany. Secondly, the communist revolution that Lenin thought would occur never would have happened. Communists were only around 13% of Germany's population, and the most aggressive communists that would have led such a revolution would have already been wiped out in the Spartacist revolt of a year before. Also, many of the communists and almost all of the democratic socialists that would have revolted would probably be horrified by the idea of a Russian conquest of Germany, and probably would have sided with the German government to prevent this. Thirdly, if there ever was a society that was ready for immediate military mobilization, it would be Germany in 1921. World War I was only 3 years earlier, and so there were millions of veterans that could be mobilized immediately without training. The same applies with the institutions for the creation of weapons and the ability to manage a war economy. In summary, the German army may have still been small because of the Versailles Treaty, but they could have easily gotten it together into total war shape very quickly. True, Germany was war-weary, but Russia was even more so, with higher casualty rates than World War I, added together with the Russian Civil War devastating the Russian heartland itself, and the war with Poland and the communist purges draining even more men. The Germans would even push back into Russian land after the failed invasion, driving into Poland and after that into Byelorussia and Ukraine, as the Red Army would collapse from the strain of yet another war with the Germans. Compared with the armies of World War I, the armies of the Russian Civil War and Russo-Polish Wars were armed mobs and they would collapse against the revamped German army. This would leave the Western powers like Britain and France confused. On one hand, they'd be happy that the hated Bolsheviks were being destroyed. On the other, they'd be terrified that Germany was once again a continental power. There would be an enormous hate for the Germans because of World War I, but there would be a strong sympathy for them being invaded and all by the communists and defending their homeland. The British and French definitely wouldn't side with the communists, who they had just been at war with a year earlier, but wouldn't side with the Germans, who they had been at war with 3 years earlier. So they would make a compromise in which they would threaten the Germans with war if they conquered territory beyond the old Polish border, so not to make a future Germany too powerful, but allow them to fight the Russians beyond that border. Ruthenia and Byelorussia would be made independent buffer states between Russia and Germany. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Soviet regime would have collapsed. The Soviets had only been in power for a few years, and their hold on Russia was tenuous. Russia was a wreck, and so would be unable to sustain a long-term war in any sense. As the Soviet armies would be crushed by the Germans, the Soviet regime back at home would lose respect and power. This is what happened to the Tsars a few years earlier, and so the same thing would happen. By the time the Germans would approach our timeline's present-day Russian border, the Soviet Union would likely collapse. They would likely be replaced by right-wing Slavic nationalists. This would be because the monarchists would be crushed during the Civil War, and the Western-style liberals would not have enough support to gain power. Russian nationalism was picking up steam before World War I. It was actually a very strong movement. They would likely make peace with the Germans just for breathing space, and the war-weary Germany would accept. The war would force the Western powers to lessen the Versailles Treaty's reparations, firstly because there would be much national sympathy for the Germans after they had been invaded and rid the world of communism, and Germany would have an enormous army who would feel aggressive and empowered after they had defeated the Russians. Neither side would want war, but would feel compelled to fight to preserve their way of life and make it feel like World War I mattered. The British and French not wanting war would allow the Germans some leeway with the Versailles Treaty. Austria actually wanted to join Germany after World War I, but the Entente would not allow it, since it would make Germany even more powerful from when it started the war, and the Entente couldn't tolerate that. However, with Germany once again being a respectable nation, expect Germany and Austria to unite at some point in the 20s. The war with Russia would cement the right to exist for the Weimar Republic in the eyes of the German people, and the Weimar Republic would become popular in Germany. This, coupled with the lack of loss of shame about losing the war, and the lessening of the Versailles Treaty, would mean Hitler would never rise to power in this timeline. Without the communist obsession with industry that force-marched Russia into industrialization in the 30s, Russia would industrialize more slowly. However, Russia was industrializing at a fairly rapid pace before World War I, and so would still likely move at a fairly quick speed without the communists, but would not have been the breakneck speed it was in our timeline. As much as Marxist historians like to belittle it, Russia was a rapidly developing economy before World War I and the Russian Civil War. Outside of their narrow obsession with industry, the communists basically ruined the Russian economy until the present. They destroyed the agricultural base that supports an industrial nation by killing the kulaks and forcing migration to the city on the part of the peasants. They destroyed personal initiative by killing the kulaks and in collectivizing agriculture, and lowered efficiency by creating government monopolies. In this timeline, with a right-wing government that wouldn't care about managing the economy, Russia would be a developing capitalist economy, much like China is in our timeline, edging towards first world status. The nationalistic Russian government would feel bitter that so much of traditionally Russian territory had been lost to the Germans and independent nations, so we should expect some sort of war in this region, as the Russians would try to reconquer the Baltics, Ruthenia, Byelorussia, and Poland. Whether or not the Russians would win such a war depends on when it would start. The later the better, since the Russians would be able to pull ahead of Germany over time as they would industrialize, while Germany would dominate an earlier war against a weaker Russia. Whether or not World War II would start in this timeline depends on whether or not the Western powers would intervene on the side of the weaker nation, whoever it happened to be at the time, to prevent the Russians or Germans from dominating Europe. If World War II did not break out in the West, we would have seen the colonial empires not grow bankrupt and tired from the war, and we would have seen the colonial empires survive. This would mean that the Western European nations would remain global superpowers. If World War II would never spread to the Pacific, Japan would likely finish its war with China with some sort of treaty giving the Japanese the eastern third of China, and then attack south into the Pacific, without their hand being forced by the fall of France to move before they wanted. Such a war would inevitably drag the US in and lead to a US defeat of the Japanese. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next video. Thank you.